Now, if you drive a sport coupe, it very well may have a manual transmission. You know, manual transmissions need special care, whether your car is front drive or rear drive. Pat Goss has more details. Pat?
Well, John, here we have one of the more mysterious parts of the automobile. This is a manual transmission, and of course we seldom, if ever, see it. It's buried way down underneath the car. And one thing's for sure, you want to hope that you never see your manual transmission looking like this one, that is, disassembled like this. But before we go into this and see some of the pitfalls in that, let's take a look at the chart that we have over here and see what goes on inside the manual transmission. Now, we have here a 3-speed manual transmission that we're going to use for to show what happens. Now, we'll start up here at the top in first gear. Now, what we have is a series of gears, some of which are movable so that we can put different combinations of gears together to give us varying ratios for either power or speed. We start up here at the top. We have an input shaft that turns with the engine, goes through these 2 gears, and it comes out here where we have a small gear driving a large gear which turns the output shaft. Now, whenever we have a small gear driving a large gear, that gives us power. Okay, so that's power, which we get in first gear. Then we go to second gear. Again, the input shaft turns, but this time our sliding gear is in a different position, and now the gear that is driving the one on the output shaft is much closer to the size of the one on the output shaft. They're almost identical. So now we have a combination of a little less power and a little more speed. This gives us our intermediate gear. Then down here we have a situation where the sliding gear has coupled the input shaft and the output shaft together. So for each revolution of the input shaft, you get 1 revolution of the output shaft. Okay, that's the way it always was. But now, in the last few years, we have 4 speeds, we have 5 speeds, and most of these are also overdrive transmissions. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that we have a couple more combinations of gears, but more than that, it means in any overdrive transmission that the gears are set up in such a manner that for each revolution of the input shaft at the engine, we get more than 1 revolution of the output shaft going to the drive wheels. Now, that means that the output shaft is turning faster than the input shaft. It is overdriven, and there comes the term overdrive. Okay. Now, what about what we can do to make this transmission last longer? You know, we look at this one. This happens to be a Doug Nash high-performance transmission. And we look at the gears and so on in here, and they look pretty massive. It looks like it would be next to impossible to damage anything in here. Well, that isn't exactly the case. Now, what can damage them? Well, one of the most typical things is that somebody forgot to check the fluid level inside the manual transmission. Every time you have the oil changed, the fluid level in the manual transmission should be checked, and it should be topped off if necessary. Now, what do you put in it? Well, the standard for many, many years has been what we have here. This is a multi-purpose gear lubricant. It's very heavy and thick. It's usually either 80 or 90 weight. Well, things are changing, though. What we find in a lot of the newer transmissions is right here. This is Dexron automatic transmission fluid. And oh yes, it is used in a lot of manual transmissions. So check your owner's manual or service manual. Make sure that whatever you put in the transmission is what is recommended for your particular one. Now, if you fail to do this, the results could be disastrous. Now, here we have some parts that have been taken out of a transmission that's identical to this one. Again, some pretty heavy, massive parts. And if we look down in here, we can see that this steel is actually torn up. It's all galled and rough looking. This was caused by a lack of lubrication. This is one of the parts that could succumb to a lack of lubrication. Another thing that will suffer in many cases is right here. This is a bearing. spin it, we hear this rough, rattly sound to it. It should be smooth as glass. Again, expensive to repair, and again, in this particular case, caused by a lack of lubrication. But, you know, this is sort of a dying breed. This is for a rear-wheel drive car. Modern automobiles, for the most part, are front-wheel drive, and we have something totally different. This is a transaxle. Now, what do we have? We would have the engine sitting right in here, and it would drive through a shaft and clutch inside this portion right here, and it would turn through a series of gears that then leads into this center section. Now, the center section of this, right along through here, this center section is a transmission, just like the one that we just finished looking at. Now, as it comes out of the transmission portion of this, this is where things really change. Instead of driving to the rear wheels of the car, it drives this big gear that we see here. This is the final drive on this transaxle. Now, this is the equivalent of a differential or rear end in a rear-wheel drive car. Now, as this would turn, it would turn these flanges, and connected to these flanges are axles that drive the front wheels. Now, what happens here if you let it run low on gear oil is very simple. All of this entire assembly is lubricated by the same quantity of lubricant. And if you let this one run dry, you could damage the entire assembly, and believe me, that could be an expensive mistake.